The Balkans, a region long defined by shifting borders and lingering grievances, had always been a tinderbox, but by the late 1930s it was ready to ignite. Rumors of German power moving inexorably across Europe reached the narrow streets of Budapest, the sprawling plains of Romania, and the ancient cities of Sofia, and people could feel the tension in the air like the first chill of a storm. For these nations, the First World War had left wounds that would not heal, and now the shadow of a new war was approaching, promising both peril and opportunity. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, three nations bound by geography but separated by culture and history, stood at a crossroads, each tempted by promises of restored glory and each fearful of the consequences of hesitation. Hungary's story began with loss. The Treaty of Trianon had reduced its borders, leaving millions of ethnic Hungarians stranded outside the nation's new lines. In Budapest, murals, songs, and daily conversation were saturated with grief for what had been taken. Politicians repeatedly spoke of revision, of correcting what history had unjustly stolen, and the public responded with fervent nationalism. By the mid-1930s, it was clear that Hungary's path to territorial recovery would not come through diplomacy alone. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the growing strength of Germany offered the possibility, however dangerous, of regaining lost lands without waiting for international approval. Yet with opportunity came risk, and every alliance made with Germany carried an invisible cost. Meanwhile, Romania faced a paradoxical situation. Having gained territories after World War I, it was larger than ever but more vulnerable than it had ever been. Its borders were ethnically diverse and politically unstable, leaving the country exposed to internal unrest and external threats. Economic difficulties fueled extremist movements like the Iron Guard, whose rhetoric promised salvation but often delivered chaos. The Soviet Union, eager to reclaim lost territories, cast a constant shadow over Romania's northern frontier, and in 1940, the occupation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina by Soviet forces confirmed the nation's precarious position. Under pressure and desperation, Romania saw in Germany a protector, a power capable of shielding it from further territorial losses and restoring its sense of national dignity. Bulgaria's grievances were no less intense. Stripped of land by the Treaty of Neuilly after World War I, it remained humiliated and frustrated, especially by the loss of Western Thrace and access to the Aegean Sea. While the nation had recovered slowly through economic and political stabilization in the interwar years, the desire to reclaim lost territories never faded. When Germany began courting Bulgaria with promises of Thrace and Macedonia if it joined the Axis, the temptation proved difficult to resist. Unlike Hungary and Romania, whose choices were partly driven by fear, Bulgaria's alignment with Germany was motivated primarily by the hope of recovering its rightful lands and reversing decades of diplomatic humiliation. As the 1930s waned, the wider European landscape shifted dramatically. Germany rearmed with abandon, violated the Treaty of Versailles, remilitarized the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, and eventually dismantled Czechoslovakia. Each step was a demonstration of boldness, legality be damned, and smaller nations across Europe watched with a mixture of awe and dread. For Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, Germany's expansion was simultaneously a threat and an opportunity. Neutrality seemed increasingly impossible, remaining on the sidelines risked irrelevance, while engagement carried the danger of being dragged into a war far larger than any of them could control. Germany's strategic planners understood that the Balkans were crucial to their broader ambitions. The region was rich in resources, strategically located for operations in the eastern Mediterranean, and, perhaps most importantly, filled with nations whose grievances could be leveraged. Through a combination of economic deals, military advisors, and political persuasion, Germany enticed Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria toward alignment. Hungary received promises of southern Slovakia and Transylvania, Romania was offered protection against the Soviets, Bulgaria was courted with Thrace and Macedonia. Over time, the gravitational pull of German power made resistance difficult to maintain, and the three nations began a slow, incremental drift into the Axis sphere. By 1939, as Germany invaded Poland and sparked World War II, the Balkans collectively held their breath. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were aware that the outcome of the conflict would likely determine their fates. The rapid German victory over France in 1940 only intensified the urgency of alignment. Britain and France, once seen as potential protectors, now appeared distant and ineffective. Germany's military might and political cunning convinced Balkan leaders that cooperation was not merely advantageous, it was essential for survival. Hungary moved first, seizing opportunities to reclaim lost territories in southern Slovakia and Carpatho-Ruthenia. Berlin rewarded Budapest for compliance, but each territorial gain came with growing dependence on German power. Romania, battered by territorial losses to the Soviets, Hungary, and Bulgaria, fell under General Ion Antonescu's authoritarian rule. The country's entry into the Axis was motivated not by desire but by survival. Fear of Soviet aggression and internal instability left Romania with little choice but to align itself with Germany's ambitions. Bulgaria, ever cautious, waited until Germany prepared to invade Yugoslavia and Greece, then allowed troop movement and formally joined the Axis, receiving the promised territories in return. Each nation, though distinct in motivation, ultimately chose alignment over neutrality, a decision that would irrevocably shape its wartime destiny. By the spring of 1941, the Balkans had become a chessboard, and Germany the unseen hand moving every piece. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria had positioned themselves as Axis supporters, each hoping to gain or protect what they valued most. None foresaw the full cost of their choices. Alignment brought temporary territorial gains and a sense of political validation, but it also entangled each country in a war from which it could not extricate itself. The promises of protection and reward were tempered by the reality that Germany's objectives were not identical to their own. Each step toward alliance was a step deeper into a conflict defined by destruction, betrayal, and moral compromise. As Europe marched toward the cataclysm of total war, the Balkan nations stood on the edge of history. Hungary's ambition, Romania's fear, and Bulgaria's caution combined to form a precarious equilibrium, one that could collapse at any moment. Decisions made in Berlin's shadow would dictate the fate of millions, and once committed, retreat would be nearly impossible. By the time German forces swept into Yugoslavia and Greece, the Axis alignment of the Balkans was complete, and the die was cast. What began as strategic maneuvering, guided by opportunity, fear, and historical grievance, was now an irreversible step into the storm of global conflict, a storm whose fury would soon engulf the entire region. Hungary, dreams entangled in war. Budapest in the early 1940s carried the strange aura of triumph tinged with fear. Citizens lined streets celebrating reclaimed territories, but behind the cheers lay an undercurrent of uncertainty that few dared voice aloud. Hungary had achieved the dream of regaining southern Slovakia and Carpatho-Ruthenia, lands that had been taken decades earlier, yet these victories came not from the nation's own power but from the shifting whims of Berlin. In a Europe increasingly dominated by Germany, Hungary's apparent gains were only the first step in a dangerous journey that would soon sweep the country into a conflict far larger and more destructive than it had imagined. Miklos Horthy, the regent of Hungary, understood the precariousness of his nation's position. A military man by training and a conservative by nature, Horthy distrusted Hitler personally and often spoke of the dangers of entangling Hungary too deeply in German ambitions. Yet he also recognized that the country's options were shrinking. Britain and France were embroiled in their own struggles, the Soviet Union lingered as an unresolved threat to the northeast, and the United States remained distant. In this environment, German support seemed less like a choice and more like a lifeline. Promises of territorial restoration and political recognition provided Hungary with a vision of revival, but the cost of dependence on Berlin was invisible to many until the first Hungarian soldiers marched east. Hungary's involvement in World War II intensified following the collapse of Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941. Berlin orchestrated both invasions with precision, and Horthy faced the pressing question of how far Hungary should commit. Occupying parts of Vojvodina offered historical justification, yet it also bound the country more closely to German strategic interests. Initially, Hungary participated cautiously, sending limited forces while seeking to project the appearance of autonomy. Public opinion favored action, encouraged by nationalist rhetoric emphasizing historic claims, but military leaders privately worried about the risks of fighting alongside an increasingly aggressive Germany. Each decision, no matter how calculated, drew Hungary deeper into a war whose ultimate shape was still unknown. The decisive moment came with Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Hungary's government attempted to remain neutral at first, but when border incidents and provocations escalated, the country declared war on the USSR. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers advanced into the vast steppes of Ukraine, motivated by patriotism, loyalty to allies, and the hope of securing additional recognition for their nation. The early months brought swift advances, and propaganda in Budapest portrayed Hungarian troops as valiant liberators of ethnic Hungarians and allies of a victorious Germany. Reality, however, soon diverged from this narrative. The deeper Hungarian forces penetrated into Soviet territory, the harsher the environment became. Winter descended with brutal intensity, supply lines stretched beyond sustainable limits, and morale began to falter. The soldiers faced an enemy that was larger, better prepared for the vast terrain, and relentless in its counterattacks. Casualties mounted, and news of the suffering filtered back to Hungary in the form of letters and official reports. Families began to sense that the war was no longer a distant affair but a tragedy that touched homes across the country. The victories celebrated in 1940 now seemed fragile, overshadowed by the immense cost of supporting Germany's eastern ambitions. The catastrophic turning point occurred at the Don River in 1943, where the Second Hungarian Army suffered near total destruction. Tens of thousands froze, starved, or were killed in combat, marking Hungary's worst military disaster since World War I. Commanders reported widespread disarray, soldiers felt abandoned, and the government confronted a bitter reality: Hungary's reliance on German power had come at an enormous human cost. Public morale faltered, and while the official narrative attempted to frame the losses as heroic sacrifices, the impact on families, communities, and the national psyche was profound and lasting. Amidst this military disaster, political tensions escalated within Hungary. Horthy began seeking secret negotiations with the Allies, hoping to extricate the country from its entanglement before Soviet forces reached its borders. Such efforts, however, were discovered by Germany, and in March 1944, German troops occupied Hungary in a swift operation that left the nation effectively under foreign control. The puppet administration that followed reduced Hungarian sovereignty to a fragile illusion, demonstrating how deeply the country's fate had become tied to the very power it once sought to exploit. Horthy remained regent in name, but real authority rested in Berlin. The German occupation had immediate and devastating consequences for Hungarian society, particularly for the Jewish population. Under Nazi pressure, Hungary's government cooperated in deportations that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Urban streets that had once echoed with the hope of restored borders became scenes of fear and despair. The nation confronted moral dilemmas of unprecedented severity, realizing that the pursuit of territorial restoration had drawn it into complicity with one of history's greatest crimes. Ordinary citizens struggled to reconcile nationalist pride with the horror unfolding around them, and the social fabric of Hungary began to fracture under the strain of occupation, war, and persecution. As Soviet troops advanced in late 1944, Hungary descended into chaos. The Arrow Cross Party, a radical fascist faction, seized power in Budapest, intensifying terror and accelerating violence against minorities and political opponents. Battles erupted across the countryside, infrastructure was destroyed, and countless civilians fled to escape the fighting. The siege of Budapest in early 1945 marked the culmination of Hungary's wartime suffering, with the city reduced to ruins and thousands of lives lost. What had begun as an attempt to reclaim Hungary's historic glory ended in devastation, illustrating the profound costs of aligning national ambitions too closely with a dominant and increasingly desperate ally. The post-war consequences were equally transformative. Hungary's temporary territorial gains were lost, and the country fell under Soviet occupation, which reshaped its political, economic, and social institutions for decades. The illusions of autonomy and influence that had driven early wartime decisions were replaced by the stark reality of external control, occupation, and reconstruction. Hungary emerged from World War II not as a victor reclaiming its past but as a nation struggling to reconcile ambition with survival, loss with memory, and the pursuit of national dreams with the devastating consequences of global conflict. Looking back, Hungary's experience during the Second World War illustrates the peril of political choices driven by immediate gains without full consideration of long-term consequences. The nation had entered the conflict with hopes of restoration and honor, only to encounter destruction, occupation, and moral compromise. Each decision from aligning with Germany to participating in the invasion of the Soviet Union carried consequences that rippled through military, civilian, and political spheres. By the war's end, Hungary was irrevocably changed, its dreams entwined with the forces of a wider European catastrophe, leaving a legacy that would resonate for generations. Romania, oil, ambition, and the turn of fate. The story of Romania during the Second World War was not written in triumph but in tension, uncertainty, and constant recalculation. By the early 1940s, Romania stood as one of Europe's most strategically significant nations, a land rich with oil fields crucial to any military campaign, particularly Germany's, whose tanks and planes depended on the resources buried in Romanian soil. Yet Romania's geography, wealth, and fractured internal politics rendered it vulnerable, a prize coveted by stronger powers and exposed to threats on all sides. The nation's path through the war became a complex dance of loyalty, survival, and sudden reversal, as ambition collided with the relentless pressures of global conflict. Romania entered the war with a sense of urgency driven by fear and humiliation. The previous year had brought losses that shocked the nation, the Soviet Union's annexation of Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, and Hungary's absorption of northern Transylvania, sanctioned by German-Italian arbitration. The monarchy, under King Carol II, had lost legitimacy in the eyes of many citizens, and political stability was virtually non-existent. Extremist movements, particularly the Iron Guard, gained traction, presenting themselves as defenders of national pride. In this volatile environment, Romania's leaders concluded that survival demanded alliance with the most formidable military power in Europe, Germany. For Berlin, Romania offered oil, troops, and a buffer against the Soviet Union, For Bucharest, Germany offered protection and the promise of territorial security. By mid-1940, General Ion Antonescu rose to power, establishing an authoritarian regime designed to restore order, consolidate military authority, and position Romania as a reliable partner to Germany. Antonescu's alignment was pragmatic rather than ideological. While his government shared certain nationalist aspirations, the overriding goal was to protect Romania from further dismemberment. This pragmatism led to swift action. Romanian troops, under Antonescu's command, prepared for a campaign alongside the Germans when the time came to confront the Soviet Union. Propaganda framed the military engagement as a patriotic mission to reclaim lost territories, and initially, this narrative resonated strongly with the population desperate to see national pride restored. In June 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, Romania joined immediately, sending divisions across the Prut River to recover Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Early successes were celebrated, with towns regained and flags raised over reclaimed territory. Soldiers believed they were liberating their homeland from foreign control, and for a moment, the nationalistic vision seemed realized. Yet as Romanian forces pressed further east, the reality of war began to erode initial enthusiasm. Long supply lines, harsh terrain, and a more formidable enemy than anticipated tested the limits of Romanian military capability. While German divisions advanced alongside them, the burden of occupation and front-line defense increasingly fell on Romanian units, whose resources were stretched thin and whose morale began to waver. The drive for further territorial influence and loyalty to Germany soon drew Romania into campaigns beyond the borders of its own interests. Romanian troops moved into Ukraine, participating in battles intended to secure German objectives rather than national priorities. The harsh conditions and fierce Soviet resistance created mounting casualties, and by late 1942, disaster struck. Romanian armies, positioned on vulnerable flanks during the German siege of Stalingrad, collapsed under Soviet counteroffensives. Tens of thousands were killed, captured, or left missing in the bitter winter landscape. News of the catastrophe reached Bucharest, leaving families in grief, towns in mourning, and the nation questioning the wisdom of its alliance with Germany. Despite the staggering losses, Antonescu maintained that Romania's future depended on loyalty to Germany. For the Romanian leadership, abandoning the Axis prematurely seemed to risk annihilation at the hands of either the Soviets or Germany itself. Yet within the country, dissent began to grow. King Michael, though initially a ceremonial figure, quietly supported negotiations with other powers, signaling the possibility of changing course if an opportunity arose. By 1944, as Soviet forces approached Romanian borders once again, the tension between continued loyalty and national survival reached a breaking point. The pivotal moment came on August 23, 1944. In a dramatic and carefully orchestrated operation, King Michael ordered the arrest of Antonescu and declared Romania's withdrawal from the Axis. Within hours, the nation reversed its position, aligning itself with the Allies and immediately beginning operations against German forces still occupying Romanian territory. This sudden shift stunned both German commanders and the Romanian population. Streets of Bucharest witnessed a mix of relief, jubilation, and apprehension as the country navigated a transition from Axis supporter to active participant in the Allied effort. The move, though risky, was driven by a clear calculation: the survival of the Romanian state required adaptation to the changing balance of power. The immediate consequences of Romania's defection were violent and chaotic. German units retaliated with force, attacking infrastructure, oil fields, and military installations. Romanian troops engaged former allies, often in fierce street-to-street battles, while civilians faced shortages and insecurity amid the turmoil. The Soviet advance provided both a protective umbrella and a new challenge. Romania, now an allied nation, was still at the mercy of a far more powerful neighbor. Soviet occupation brought its own forms of political and social restructuring, marking the beginning of a post-war transformation that would redefine the nation's governance, economy, and society for decades to come. By the time World War II ended, Romania's path through the conflict had left the nation altered irrevocably. It had begun the war attempting to preserve territorial integrity, suffered catastrophic losses fighting alongside Germany, and ultimately switched sides in a dramatic attempt to secure survival. Each phase of Romania's involvement, loyalty, overextension, catastrophe, and defection reflected the immense pressures faced by a country caught between rival powers. While the decision to align with Germany had initially seemed pragmatic, the unforeseen human and moral costs of that alliance left scars on society and reshaped national memory. Romania's story in World War II exemplifies the fragile calculus of small and medium powers in a world dominated by giants, where decisions of survival and ambition were inseparable from the wider currents of global conflict. In retrospect, Romania's wartime trajectory underscores the interplay of geography, resources, and political strategy. Its oil fields made it an indispensable partner for Germany but also a target for the Soviets, forcing Romanian leaders to navigate a path between competing interests with little margin for error. The nation's internal divisions, ideological movements, and the personal ambitions of leaders like Antonescu compounded the complexity of decision-making. By acting pragmatically, Romania initially sought to safeguard its future, but the relentless pressures of global war soon demonstrated that even careful calculation could not prevent enormous sacrifice. Ultimately, Romania emerged from World War II as a nation profoundly changed. Its temporary victories were replaced by occupation, its alliance with Germany by alignment with the Allies, and its autonomy constrained by the presence of far more powerful neighbors. The choices made between 1940 and 1944 illustrate both the allure and the danger of strategic alignment. Promises of protection, territorial restoration, and influence came with costs measured not only in territory but in lives, societal cohesion, and political freedom. Romania's story is thus a testament to the precarious balance small and mid-sized nations must navigate in times of total war, where survival often requires adaptation, courage, and the ability to reverse course in the face of inexorable change. Bulgaria, between promise and peril. Sofia in the early 1940s exuded a quiet tension, a city caught between the shadow of past humiliations and the looming power of global conflict. Bulgaria had emerged from the First World War with deep grievances, lost territories, limited access to the Aegean, and a population still mourning regions that were once Bulgarian. Unlike some of its neighbors, the nation had chosen restraint over ambition, seeking gradual recovery rather than immediate confrontation. Yet the winds of Europe's Second Great War could not be ignored. As Germany expanded its reach, Bulgaria faced a choice that would test the limits of patience, diplomacy, and national resolve. The promise of recovering Macedonia and Thrace dangled like a carrot, while the threat of entanglement in a brutal global conflict loomed ever closer. King Boris III, the monarch guiding Bulgaria through these uncertain waters, understood the tightrope his nation had to walk. Unlike Hungary or Romania, Bulgaria's leaders were wary of outright alignment with Germany. Their strategy relied on patience, avoiding rash decisions while assessing which path would secure the most benefit with the least risk. Public sentiment was equally cautious. While many Bulgarians longed for territorial restoration, there was little appetite for the destruction and moral compromise that total war might bring. The government's approach reflected this duality: cooperate when necessary, resist when possible, and maintain as much autonomy as circumstances allowed. Germany's interest in Bulgaria grew steadily from 1939 onward. The Balkan Peninsula was strategically crucial for operations against Greece and Yugoslavia, and German planners understood that securing Bulgaria's cooperation would facilitate rapid troop movements without prolonged conflict. Berlin's offers were enticing: assistance in regaining lost territories, political influence, and a position of prominence in the emerging Axis order. For Bulgaria, the temptation was significant but fraught with danger. To accept German demands too fully risked provoking the Allies and the Soviet Union, both of which could respond with force. To refuse entirely was nearly impossible in the face of German military might pressing at its borders. Bulgaria's initial stance was neutrality, maintained with remarkable skill despite mounting pressure. The government allowed careful trade with Germany while refusing to commit troops to campaigns outside its immediate interests. Intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and covert communications flowed continuously between Sofia, Berlin, and Moscow, each message a test of the nation's resolve. The monarchy sought to demonstrate a willingness to cooperate, yet drew lines around the nation's sovereignty and moral boundaries. When Germany demanded participation in the invasion of the Soviet Union, Bulgaria refused, insisting that it had no quarrel with the Soviets. This refusal was a bold move, marking Bulgaria as an Axis member with limits, a state that could resist when necessary. By 1941, the strategic pressures became undeniable. Germany prepared to invade Yugoslavia and Greece, requiring troop passage through Bulgarian territory. King Boris, weighing the risks, allowed German forces to transit but stopped short of full participation. Shortly thereafter, under diplomatic and military pressure, Bulgaria formally joined the Axis. The government's commitment was pragmatic rather than ideological. For Boris and his ministers, alignment was a calculated necessity aimed at securing Macedonia and Thrace without sacrificing the nation's autonomy or moral boundaries. Across the recovered regions, public celebrations marked the return of Bulgarian administration, yet beneath the festivities lay an awareness that these gains had come at the cost of involvement in a broader war. Despite formal Axis membership, Bulgaria maintained a unique stance in wartime diplomacy. While it implemented some anti-Jewish legislation under German pressure, it notably refused to deport Jews from pre-war Bulgarian territory. Clergy, politicians, and ordinary citizens played crucial roles in preventing the forced removal of thousands, demonstrating a rare and significant act of collective defiance. Yet the country's capacity for moral action had limits. Jews in occupied Greek and Yugoslav regions under Bulgarian administration were not spared, illustrating the complex ethical landscape the nation navigated. Each decision required balancing German expectations with domestic opinion, humanitarian concern, and the ever-present calculation of survival. Bulgaria's cautious approach extended to military engagement. It avoided front-line participation against the Soviet Union, kept its forces primarily for defense and territorial administration, and limited involvement in Axis campaigns beyond its borders. These measures preserved Bulgarian lives and minimized destruction, contrasting sharply with the catastrophic losses experienced by Hungary and Romania on the Eastern Front. Yet the very caution that safeguarded Bulgaria also increased German suspicion, leaving the nation in a delicate position, too cooperative to provoke reprisal, too restrained to earn full trust. As the tide of war turned against Germany, Bulgaria faced new challenges. The Soviet advance through Eastern Europe threatened the nation, and domestic debate intensified over whether to continue the Axis alliance or seek accommodation with the Allies. King Boris's sudden death in 1943 created a political vacuum, leaving power in the hands of regents and ministers whose opinions on foreign alignment diverged sharply. By 1944, the inevitability of Soviet presence forced Bulgaria into decisive action. The government dismissed pro-German officials, declared neutrality, and signaled willingness to cooperate with the Allies in a bid to preserve sovereignty and mitigate occupation consequences. Yet the timing of these measures meant that Bulgaria could not completely dictate its fate. September 1944 marked the final turning point. Soviet forces entered Bulgarian territory without resistance, and the existing government was quickly replaced by a pro-Soviet administration. Overnight, Bulgaria transitioned from reluctant Axis member to Allied participant, declaring war on Germany and contributing troops to campaigns in neighboring Yugoslavia and Hungary. The rapid shift reflected both pragmatism and necessity. Bulgaria's leaders sought to align with the emerging victor to protect the nation from occupation's harsher consequences. The transition, though relatively smooth compared to other Axis states, marked the end of Bulgaria's delicate balancing act and initiated a new era of political transformation. Post-war Bulgaria emerged with a mixed legacy. The country had avoided the devastation experienced by many of its neighbors, preserved a degree of moral agency in its refusal to deport domestic Jews, and retained significant territorial gains temporarily. Yet Soviet occupation and the imposition of communist governance reshaped the political, social, and economic landscape. Bulgaria's wartime strategy, careful diplomacy, selective cooperation, and moral restraint had secured survival, but at the cost of autonomy and the certainty of national decision-making. The lessons of these years: how small nations navigate between powerful actors, balance ambition with caution, and confront moral dilemmas under duress, remained ingrained in the national consciousness. Ultimately, Bulgaria's journey through World War II illustrates the precariousness of neutrality and the complexity of alliance. It was a nation whose leaders sought to recover lost honor without succumbing to the full destructiveness of global war, whose people resisted moral compromise where possible, and whose fate depended on a keen understanding of timing, leverage, and the shifting balance of power. The narrative of Bulgaria is not one of dramatic conquest or heroic battles, but of survival achieved through careful calculation, principled resistance, and the ability to adapt to the inexorable pressures of history. By the war's end, Bulgaria had traversed the narrow path between promise and peril, emerging battered but intact, its future forever shaped by the choices made in the shadow of giants.